Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm really excited for today's video. It is one of my favorites to film every single quarter, and today I'm bringing you my quarterly palette usage. So sharing with you all of my palette usage from April to the end of June, what palettes I used the most, how many times I used each palette, etc. I have been doing this for a year and a half now, and I really enjoy doing it because it really does open my eyes to palettes that I am not using, maybe favorite palettes in my collection that I think I'm using, but I actually am not really using that much. I just think I am because they're favorites. I do have a video coming up in a couple of days about the 42 unused eyeshadow palettes in my collection as of 2021. So they've been unused all of 2021. So if you guys are interested in hearing all of the data, you guys know I like to get super nerdy, super geeky on this channel and share so much data. Stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project painting content, palette themed content, or you just like to chit chat about makeup, I would love if you would consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. All right, you guys, I think we're on day 4 of palette week. I hope that you guys are enjoying. I always love when you guys leave me recommendations for palette themed content that you would like to see in the future from me. So leave your comments down below, but I'm going to be pulling up my spreadsheet with all of my information, and I will actually scoot over a little bit so I can post graphics here that kind of like compare this quarter to last quarter, etc. Okay, I tried to clear my desk off so it's not as messy. Okay, so the months that we are tracking here, April to June, I definitely wore makeup and eyeshadow so much more than I did in January through March. So I was really surprised to find that percentage-wise, I used less of my palette collection than I did the first quarter of the month, just because I had figured I had used way more this time around. But in the first quarter, I used 60% of my palette collection, and this quarter, I only used 51% of my eyeshadow palette collection. So essentially half of my eyeshadow palette collection went untouched the last 3 months. And I count a use in a palette as reaching into the palette for just a single shade. So I currently have, I believe, 129 palettes, give or take. Sometimes I don't add my palettes into my spreadsheet until like I've used it. If it's a new palette, I don't add it till I use the palette. I'm a little bit confused by my own spreadsheet, if I'm being honest, but I believe I was tracking 129 palettes at this time, and I ended up using 72 palettes, and 70 of my palettes, 70, went unused the last 3 months. So 49% went unused compared to only 40% unused in the first quarter of the year. Year to date, like I said, I have 42 palettes currently in my collection that have not yet been touched. I believe 9 of those I have purchased this year that I just still have not gotten around to using or testing, but that means that 31 of those I've owned all 6 months and have not used. So then I split my usage into different categories or different tiers of use, and I have 4 tiers of use. So the first tier is using it or using each palette 1 to 5 times. The second tier is using it anywhere between 6 and 10 times. Third tier is anywhere between 11 and 19 times. And then the fourth tier is 20 plus. So again, I will post quarter 1 compared to quarter 2 over here, but this quarter I used a total of 62 palettes between 1 and 5 times, which was actually the exact same number as quarter 1. So in quarter 1, I also used 62 of my palettes between 1 and 5 times. In the second tier, this quarter, I used 12 eyeshadow palettes anywhere between 6 and 10 times, which is 1 palette more than quarter 1 when I only used 11 palettes between 6 and 10 times. For the 11 to 19 tier, I had 4 palettes fall into this category this quarter, and I only had 2 last quarter. So there were definitely more palettes this quarter that I was reaching for more consistently than I was in my first quarter. And then in the 20 plus category, I had 2 eyeshadow palettes, and I had 2 eyeshadow palettes in this category for quarter 1. So I was really surprised when looking at this, again, that I had used more of my collection the first quarter or the first 3 months of the year as opposed to the second 3 months of the year. So that was super eye-opening. I'm looking now, I think I had 129 palettes in quarter one and I have 136 now. Just as a side note. But now we're gonna get into the palettes that, so I'm only sharing tier 2, 3, and 4. So the ones that got 6 to 10, 11 to 19, and then 20 plus. The rest of the palette, like this video would be way too long if I shared the palettes that I had used anywhere between 1 and 5 times. We're gonna get into the tier of 6 to 10 uses. I have 12 palettes, like I said, that fall into that tier, and we're just gonna get into those now. So up first, I have my Urban Decay Stone Vibes. This is currently in my Pan Those Eyeshadows, and I'm working on the shade Meditate, which is likely the reason that this has gotten the use that it did this last month. I don't see myself reaching into this, having reached into this that many times had it not been in my Pan Those Eyeshadows project, but I do really love this eyeshadow palette, especially for some of the topper shades in here. So I'm really glad that it was rolled in and I did get use out of it. This palette I did end up reaching for 8 total times. And then I have my Urban Decay Born to Run palette, which I reached for 6 times. This is a palette that I included in my palettes on their last hurrah. I'll link that video down below. It was essentially a series I started on my channel this year that was, I included palettes that I was thinking I was going to declutter at the end of the year, but I wasn't quite ready to declutter them. So I wanted to focus on them this year, use them, and then feel a little bit more comfortable potentially decluttering them. This is a palette I don't see myself decluttering now at the end of the year, just because I've really fallen back in love with this palette. I wouldn't say this is a favorite palette anymore by any means, but it's something that I do find myself like wanting to reach into this palette. So I really enjoyed reaching for this, and this is one that I do think will stay in my collection. I have been doing so many neutral looks all year long, so I have reached into my Rowan 75 Degrees quad as a cream kind of just base before going in with like my Natasha Denona mini nude, and I reached into this 6 total times this past month. I am really hoping that I can get some more use on my 1111 quad, because I actually think that quad is more of my favorite in terms of color story, but this is such an easy one to reach for and use. You guys know I've raved about the Rowan quads a ton on my channel. I just think they have really fun and unique formulas, and I was really excited to get use out of this because I do feel like these are shadows that, because it's just not like your everyday average shadow, sometimes I ignore these. So I was excited to see these make this video. My ColourPop Sparkler Quad. Sorry, this isn't Sparkler, this is Creamsicle. I absolutely adore this little color story, this quad. I think the foiled shades are really beautiful, and I reached for this a total of 6 times as well. I highly recommend the ColourPop quads. I think they're really good quality and I've really enjoyed them. Next up, I have the NARS Summer Solstice, and this is a newer palette to my collection, and I've already reached for this 7 times, which 7 may not sound like a lot, but for me, this is a lot, especially considering this is a newer palette. So I've just wanted to reach for this a ton. I love the color story for the summer. It just kind of gives me like that neutral bronzy vibe that I've really been into, and I've reached for that 7 times. I was kind of surprised by this one, but my Menagerie Pastel Pup palette I have reached for 6 times. I've enjoyed using this white shade as a base if I'm wanting to go in and really make other shadows pop, but I also have been reaching for this pastel yellow quite a bit as well. I think this is such a good quality, fun pastel palette. It's kind of hard to get your hands on just because it goes in and out of stock so often. It took me months to finally get my hand on this, but I'm really excited that I did, and I'm excited that I've used it 6 times. My Alter Ego Artemis palette, I have also reached for this a total of 6 times. This has been in my Pan Those Eyeshadows this year. I'm currently working on the shade Captivate right here, and I do really enjoy this palette. I love that it has some really beautiful, really rich bronze tones in here, but I also love the like blue and green shimmers. The foiled shades in this palette are so beautiful, very metallic, very high shine. Super impressed with the quality, especially considering this palette was only $22, and I'm excited to continue to reach for this one. Huda Mercury Retrograde is also going in a Pan Those eyeshadows, and I'm so happy because this is one of those palettes that I love in my collection, but find myself holding back from reaching for it because sometimes I feel like I need to save my favorites for special occasions, which just really does not make sense. But I have reached into this palette a total of 6 times, if I did not say. Such a beautiful palette. You guys know I love this palette. I've raved about this palette so much on my channel, so I'm not going to drone on, but I'm happy that this one is getting some love and should continue to have a lot more use into Q3 as well. Then I have my ColourPop Sweet Talk palette. I purchased this year. I can't remember exactly when, but I reached for this a ton in the springtime just because it's a really beautiful spring shade. And when I say a ton, I reached for this 6 total times, which actually like is a lot. I feel like that does not sound like a lot to most people, but to me 6 times is a lot. I love the shade right here. This like Super Shock shade I think is beautiful, but I love the coral tones in this as well. So reached for that 6 times. Then we have my Natasha Denona Mini Glam, which I reached for a total of 10 times. And I mostly reached into this for this shade right here as an inner corner highlight. Sometimes I just love to do something super easy, like reach for a Natasha Denona Mini for my inner corner. I also reached for the Mini Nude and the Mini Love a ton for inner corner highlights, which is why this one got a ton of use. I didn't necessarily reach into this a bunch to like just use this palette to create a look, but as an inner corner highlight, that did get a lot of use. And then the 12th palette in this section, I was surprised about this. I knew I had reached for this, but I didn't really realize I had reached for this one 7 times. This is the Odin's Eye Norns eyeshadow palette, and it looks like this. I don't believe I ever came back to review this. I fell off my palette ranking series very early this year. I do plan to get back into that. The last video in Palette Week will be me ranking all of the eyeshadow palettes that I've been trying this year. There are a ton, and then I will continue to rank my palettes monthly for you guys. But this is so beautiful. I love that it's deeper. I think I'll get a ton of use out of this in the fall winter as well. I love the fun shimmers. They're very intense, very metallic, very high shine too, and they're just really fun colors. So I've had a ton of fun reaching into this palette as well. Next up, moving into the 11 to 19 category, I have 4 palettes, like I said. Up first, I have my ABH Jackie palette, which I reached for 14 times. This is one of my favorite palettes in my collection, and this did not get enough use last year, especially considering it is a favorite palette. So this is another repeat. I reached for this a lot last quarter as well, or this got more use than quite a few other palettes in my collection last quarter, but I have been reaching into this so often, and I'm really happy to finally be giving this palette the love that it deserves in my collection, because it's such a beautiful palette. It is a favorite, but I find myself hesitating to reach for it. My Nabla Side by Side is another favorite palette in my collection, and I reached into this 13 times. This is just a very easy, you can tone it down for work kind of palette. Very just simple and easy to create looks, but you can also really make a beautiful sultry smoky eye. It can really take you from day to night. If I didn't say I reached into this 13 times, I do have a pan in this palette now. This has definitely replaced my soft glam for me. Like, I don't feel like I need ABH soft glam in my collection anymore, because I would just rather reach into this. This is another repeat that is in a tier both this last quarter and this quarter, so clearly that tells you I love that one. Next up, I have my Tarte Love Trust and Fairy Dust palette, which actually is a palette that I just absolutely love in my collection. This is another one that I put in my palettes on their last Hurrah series, and I don't think I'll end up decluttering this as well. I reached for this 13 times. I lost this for a little bit, and then I found it in a drawer that I wasn't expecting it to be in, and I just could not stop reaching for it. I do have 2 pans in this palette, and I love this palette for both the mattes and shimmers. I just think it's beautiful. Love the mauves. I think I'll get a ton of use out of this in the fall winter as well, and I'm very glad that I have been showing that love, and I think I've made my decision that I don't plan to declutter it at the end of the year. And then the last palette in this category is my Too Faced Born This Way Natural Nudes palette. This one is new to my collection this year, and I reached for this a total of 14 times. This is another very everyday friendly palette that gives you like a range of options. Like you can do a pinky mauve, you can do a deeper sultry warm brown, you can do neutral browns, you can really do whatever, which just makes it such an easy palette to reach into. And that is why I think I've reached into it 14 times. Love this palette so much. I think this is an amazing palette. Some of the metallic shades or metallic foiled shimmer shades are a little bit chunkier, mostly these two, so wanted to point that out, but I still love this palette and I think it's beautiful. So that brings us to our 20+ tier, and I had 2 eyeshadow palettes fall into this tier. The first palette is my Natasha Denona Mini Nude, and I have been reaching into this so much. I have 2 pans now on this palette. I reached into this 21 total times in the last 3 months, and it wasn't just for a single shade. Like those 21 times were like me creating looks with this palette, not just, oh, I'm reaching into it for the one inner corner highlight, or I'm reaching into it just for this shade. Sometimes I would do a one and done look with this shade, but 21 times, like really kind of basing a look off this palette. I loved this palette before, but really fell in love with this palette the last couple of months, which is very obvious in the 21 uses it got. And then my Melt Mary Jane. Anyone surprised? Because this palette nobody seems to like. Let me get to what palette, or to why I've used this 29 times. You've reached for this 29 total times. I do have a pan in this palette as well, right here in this shade. I don't know how well you'll be able to see, but I was using this as like a brow powder, which is why this got 29 uses. I probably only created looks with this palette maybe 4 or 5 times. This is a palette that takes a lot of effort. It takes glitter glue. It's still really messy. I could see why people would not enjoy this palette, but I did reach into it 29 times because I loved this shade for a brow shade. And I've also been mixing it a little bit with this more taupey cool tone shade for a brow shade as well. So 29 total uses for that. So those are all of the palettes that got the most use in my collection. That is all of the data. I do really quick want to share, I do have 3 palettes. I've kind of already like shouted them out, but I have 3 palettes that have been repeats that fell into one of those top 3 tiers that got either 6 or more uses the last couple of months, or the first 6 months of the year. So in order from least use to most, Sultry was in both quarters as a palette that got used 6 or more times. I am at 15 total uses with this palette for the year. So still hasn't gotten as much use as this. At the end of the year, I'll share like my most used palettes, obviously, but this is one that I continue to reach for on a relatively consistent basis every quarter. So that one has 15 total uses. Then we have the ABH Jackie, which I have at 22 total uses for the year. So I used this 6 or more times, again, both quarters of the year, and I intend to do that the rest of the year. I'm hoping that by the end of the year, I can get this up to like 50 or more uses. That is my goal. And then also my Nabla Side by Side. This is the one that has the most out of the repeats, if you will. This is at 25 total uses for the year, so still less than my Melt Mary Jane. But again, this is one that I intend to still consistently reach for, just because it's so easy to do whatever kind of look you want to do in terms of like a neutral look, and I just have so much fun with this palette. It is definitely a favorite in my collection, and I'm excited to continue to reach for that. But that is going to wrap it up for my Q2 palette usage. I would love to know if you guys track your palette usage and what some of your most used or least used palettes are throughout this year of 2021. Do you have a bunch of eyeshadow palettes currently in your collection that you have not yet used this year? Again, look out for that video. I have my 42 unused eyeshadow palettes video coming up in a couple of days. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch today's video and for supporting my channel as you guys always do. I hope you're having fun for this palette week. I know that I've had so much fun filming these videos. So thank you for your support. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in tomorrow's video. Bye.